Okay, well, the history of the holiday. That's what we're going to look at. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how how the celebration of Christmas kind of evolved and became a normal observance in the church, and then we'll look at some claims and myths about what people believe about Christmas and how it came about. And then we'll take a look at maybe some of the big items, symbols, and traditions, and just kind of judge about, what do these things mean? Why did they come about? Where do these things even come from? Why do we celebrate the way we do? Why do we have trees? Why do we have nativities? Why do we have, just all these things? Where did they come from? And so we're just going to take a look at that, and hopefully we'll be able to make it through it. First, one thing I want to address, because if you spend too much time watching certain channels that always have these specials with their experts and historians that will tell you what Christmas really means, or if you're, go online much at all, you're going to run into this idea that Christmas originated from pagan holidays. Right, that there was maybe some pagan holiday that the church just kind of slapped a cross sticker on the side of it and said, that one's ours now, and renamed it and turned it into something else. Or that culturally it just kind of evolved. You'll hear people say all kinds of things about Christianity being pagan.
People against goodness and normalcy. P-A-G-A-N. Pagan.
I've been looking for an excuse to use that clip. I love that movie. If you haven't seen Dragnet, yeah. All right, good stuff. Pagan, right? Pagan just means basically in the Christian context, it's non-Christian religions, right? It's idol worship. It's worship of other gods. And so people say, well, really what happened was Christmas came about, these ideas of Jesus came about because they were copied from other gods, like for instance, Mithra or Mithras, right? That this was actually some yard signs that an atheist group in Florida did that said Mithra is the reason for the season. This is a picture of the Egyptian god Horus, who says, I was savior of humanity before it was cool. And there are claims that Jesus, not only the birth, but just Jesus in general, has been copied from these other pagan religions. And so what I want to do is take a look at that claim. I want us to, and I want to spend a lot of time on it, because I want to get an actual Christian history, not the weird conspiracy theories that people come up with, but these ideas are out there. There's like entire documentaries that people have poured money into to try to prove to you that your religion actually has pagan roots and isn't what you believe it is. So I do want to address it. I'm going to address it with a video by an organization called Lutheran Satire. Right? Preaching the good news through comedy is kind of their thing. They use humor and satire. And this is a little 5 or 6 minute video where they just address some of these claims. And so we're going to let them, since they've done the heavy lifting, we'll let them address it for us. So that basically addresses the issue, I think, of the whole Jesus is a copy of pagan, and Christmas is just some copycat celebration of some pagan deities. Those are like the biggest, most often cited claims of supposed deities that Jesus is a copycat of, and they obviously have no leg to stand on. So let's actually look at Christianity. Let's look at the church, the early church, and how it is that they came about to celebrate Christmas. Where did it come from? Because we don't actually see Christmas being celebrated in the early church. It's not in the Bible, right? I mean, you have Christmas in the Bible, right? The actual event itself. But throughout the book of Acts and all of the epistles and all the writings in the rest of the New Testament, you see no hint of the church celebrating the birth of Christ as an official holiday. Yeah, I mean, you don't see it even as an unofficial holiday. It's just not mentioned as being something that they're observing. However, by the year 400, it is an established, widespread, recognized holiday that is part of the church calendar of holidays. So we're going to take a look at what happened in those 400 years and kind of try to piece together how it came about. I like timelines, so let's look here. You have way back at the beginning, Christ is born, but then, the big deal whenever the church starts is after his death and resurrection in about 30 AD. And then in 400 AD, Christmas is widely celebrated, but what goes on in between? Okay, so the first thing that we're going to see is that early on, the idea of celebrating births at all was kind of frowned on. We have Origin of Alexandria in about 200 AD. I don't know when exactly he did this. His life kind of spread the late 2nd century into the early 3rd century, but he would actually mock and ridicule pagan celebrations of the births of their deities. So we have leaders in the early church actually mocking and ridiculing the idea of the celebration of this type. So you can kind of see that even within the first 200 years, 150 years, people aren't really celebrating Christmas. All the focus is on the cross, right? I mean, because it's the sacrifice, it's the grace, it's the salvation we receive. That's where all the focus is in the early church. However, it's right around this time things start to change, because you have Clement, also from Alexandria, who in his writings, a little bit early into the 200s, he's stating, it was long and boring and convoluted, so I didn't reproduce it, but he's pointing out that there's a debate going on as far as when was Jesus born. There's still no celebration going on, but people are starting to talk about it. They're actually starting to think about it and trying to figure it out. It's becoming an issue they're interested in. And so between 200 AD and 300 AD, you actually see interest in the birth of Christ kind of ramp up and just start to gain momentum. This is actually about the time period when you get some of the fake gospels, and their birth narratives are just fantastic, just like, out of this world kind of stories in them, and I like the Gospels are kind of, like low key. Here's the stuff that happened. And then these fake Gospels that come about this time start to have all the just out of this world, fantastical kind of things built into their ideas of the birth narrative. There starts to be some focus on that. Then in 312 AD, so this is not quite 200 years or 300 years after Jesus' resurrection and the church established, that you get the very first recorded instance of a group of people celebrating Christmas. And on December 25th, it's a group called the Donatists. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. But they were in northern Africa, and in 312, it is recorded that they are celebrating Christmas on December 25th. So here we have, for the first 300 years of Christian history, there's no official notice. No, it wasn't really on people's radar much. And then all of a sudden, here it is popping up. Now, we shouldn't be surprised at that. We're talking about records from 17, 18, 1900 years ago. Things just don't last. We've talked about before in other lessons dealing with manuscripts and copies of the Bible and things that we have, that from that time period, there's a lot of stuff that we know was written that we don't have copies of. Because we'll have an author refer to something and quote it, but we don't have that something. We just have this other thing from later. So there's things we know existed they don't last. We're talking 2,000 years ago. Paper tends to not last that long. So 312 is the first official record of someone celebrating. And then between 300 and 400 AD, we actually see celebrations of Christmas becoming established and actually getting on the calendar and becoming official church practice, so that by about 400 AD, it is established. That it is, Christmas is part of the regular Christian celebration calendar. Interestingly, in the Western churches, I guess from your point of view, the Western churches over in the Rome area, Latin-speaking world, you had December 25th was the prevailing day. Over in the Eastern churches, in like Asia Minor and that side of the world, you ended up getting more of January 6th. And so you actually, the church is kind of split on what exactly the day is, but they are widespread celebration going on. There wasn't a lot of information on that as far as how exactly what their celebrations look like. One reference I did come across was in Rome, there was a group that part of their celebration was that they would actually face the sunrise, and so that was actually maybe some little pagan influence, and what I read were people who were complaining about the way they celebrated it. Now, that's a later Baptist thing. The early Catholics knew that. There was one reference to a celebration in Jerusalem that had some kind of nativity sort of theme thing going on. It wasn't specific. And that the bishop of Jerusalem would actually make a journey out to Bethlehem as part of the tradition and celebration of that day. But no, I didn't find much in the way of actual specifics of what they did. And so we have these two different dates, December 25th and January 6th. Why are there two different dates? That is a wonderful question. I'm glad you asked. Because you have basically the East and West divide in the church is the Roman Latin-speaking world in the West and the Greek kind of focused cultural world in the East. And they both have their two different kinds of calendars. They don't use the same calendar. They don't use the same way of reckoning years and time. And whenever they're trying to figure out when was Christ born, they're referring to documents that use different calendars than they use. So you'll have, a Greek calendar over here and a Roman calendar over here, but they're referring to a Hebrew calendar or an Egyptian document that's based on things of an Egyptian calendar. And then they're making certain assumptions in their kind of calculations of what exactly the day is. And so the scholars on one side, coming up with a different date. So it just depends on how they date other events, ends up how they date Christ's birth. Does that make sense? So you basically have two schools of thought trying to do the same thing, and they end up coming up with roughly the same but slightly different answers. We'll actually look a little bit of why that is here in a little bit. And so if at any point you do have a question, what James did wasn't rude to just, interrupt and ask a question. That wasn't rude. I want you to do that. So feel free to stop me anytime. Now, since we are not Eastern Orthodox, we're Baptist, and we celebrate on the 25th, why do we celebrate on December 25th? Why is Christmas on December 25th? That is a great question. You guys ask really good questions. There are four main kind of ideas that people put out there. And they have to do with again, the idea that we kind of baptized pagan celebrations. And these first three have to do with other pagan religion celebrations that people claim Christians just kind of came along and said, oh, hey, we celebrate that too, and took over the holiday. Kind of like people do with Halloween, right? There's churches all over the place that go, oh, we don't want to celebrate Halloween, right? That's satanic, that's the Day of the Dead, that's whatever. And so it's a fall festival, right? And so they do something different on that day to kind of, repurpose and kind of baptize the holiday into something Christian. And that has certainly gone on in the church. There are times that you can point out and go, oh yeah, that started like this, the church made it that, new thing. The question is that what happened with Christmas? These first three, those are the popular claims. We're going to look at those. And then the fourth one is that, no, they were just trying to make their historical calculations. And if you can't tell by this point, that's the one that I think is most accurate. So let's take a look at these. First off, Mithras, which was so wonderfully addressed in the video. Now, as much as Jesus is definitely not a copy of Mithras, there were Mithras religion around at the same time. And so you do have Christianity side by side with Mithras cults. And so people say, oh, well, they kind of took this thing and just kind of transitioned it into and made it into a Christian thing. And as you know, it referenced in the video, the idea that Mithras was born on December 25th, which the really big problem with that is there are no records at all of Mithras' birthday. None. Zero. There are no records that claim that Mithras was born on any day at all, much less December 25th. And so the idea that Christians just copied that, well, how can you show we copied something that didn't actually exist? If there was no celebration, you can't say we copied it. And so that one is kind of dead in the water. Probably the biggest that people point at is a celebration called Saturnalia. It was a Roman celebration. It was a sun festival. All of these around the wintertime tend to focus around the sun because, you know, what is the kind of big astronomical event that happens in winter? It's the solstice, which is when, you know, the days are getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And then at one point, you know, sometime in late December, what's that? 21st. That's when it switches and the days start getting longer and longer and longer and longer. And so they're saying, oh, it's a rebirth of the sun. It's you know, the sun is, you know, reasserting control, you know, whatever, you know, they would believe. And so it was common for there to be celebrations around this time of year. And people said, oh, well, you know what, Christians, they just kind of, you know, slapped that fish sticker on the side of Saturnalia and said, this is ours now, and, you know, made it into a new thing. The really big problem with that is Saturnalia was celebrated, it was a feast that lasted for 7 days. I like that one. Christmas 7-day feast. Here's the thing, though. The big day, like the day that was the big celebration and then it drug out for 7 days, was on December 17th. So this feast, this festival, was celebrated from the 17th through the 23rd. What date do you not see in that? The 25th. It doesn't make much sense to say we're going to celebrate Christ on the 25th to take over Saturnalia whenever Saturnalia is the week before. That doesn't actually accomplish anything. And so that just doesn't actually match up. There's some other reasons, but I think that one right there just kind of just really sets it out there and goes, no, this can't actually be the case. Right? We're not trying to copy or take over Saturnalia. The dates don't match. The one that kind of seems to have some documentation to it is the celebration of Sol Invictus. That's Latin. Sol means sun. There's the name of the god is the sun god. And Invictus means unconquered or unconquerable. And so the idea is that try to think how to explain it. There is a calendar, it's kind of like an almanac that was uncovered that mentions Natalis Sol Invictus. Natalis meaning birth, so the birth of the sun, or the birth of the unconquerable sun. The problem is, and it's a Christian thing, and there's also some reference to Jesus, and it mentions the December 25th, so people go, aha, Natalis Invictus, that must be referring to Sol Invictus. So therefore, that is celebration on December 25th. The Christians copied it. The only problem is there actually is no regular date for this celebration. The records we have it everywhere from September to late December. It's all over the place. And it kind of came and went depending on what emperor was in favor, right? So you had an emperor that kind of brought this religion in, and then he didn't last. People didn't like him. He got assassinated. But then a couple decades later, you have another emperor who was like, no, I liked that religion. And so he brought it back, and it really fluctuated. So to say, oh, well, December 25th, we nailed down the date, December 25th, to take over this holiday, except it was a floating holiday. So nailing it down on December 25th wouldn't actually accomplish anything. The reference, okay, it's referencing the year 354 AD, okay? And it says that N is an abbreviation for natalis, for birth, invicti, or birth of the unconquered. Now, a couple of problems with saying that this is referring to this pagan god and Christians taking over is, one, in that phrase it does not specifically refer to the god Sol. It just says birth of the unconquerable. Hey, that could be Jesus, right? I mean, he's the Lord, none greater than him. So you could see, I mean, the word invictus isn't specific to that god. That's a common word. It's used all over the place. It's Latin. It was Rome. It's a common word. Also, in that phrase, in that reference, it does not specifically mention Sol. So it doesn't say Natalis Sol Invictus. But people assume, oh, well, yeah, but it must be referring to that. No, because in other places in that same document, it specifically refers to Sol, the god, Sol, S-O-L. And so if it specifically refers to it in other places, why would it leave it out there? Doesn't quite make sense. Also, it's referring to the date 354 AD. Okay, well, when did we say was the first celebration of Christmas on December 25th? 312. Well, by this time, we're already celebrating Christmas on December 25th. We're not taking over a Roman holiday. It was already being celebrated for other reasons. And I want to take a look at those reasons, because I think this is really where the date comes from. When you look into the early church and what they believed and what they were saying about Christmas, this is how they argued. There were two ways. One, they argued from the birth of John the Baptist. If they could date the birth of John the Baptist, then they could figure out when Jesus was born. Right? Because in Luke chapter 1, Mary and Elizabeth, they're relatives. They're both pregnant at the same time. And so if you can date John, then you can date Jesus. So that's how some people look at it. Others date the birth from the crucifixion. That seems kind of weird, so let's take a look at that. How do you get from the cross to the manger? How does that dating work? You need some very specific information. Actually, you don't, because it was a common belief back then, not just among Christians, but it's verified in Jewish sources, that it was believed that men of God, holy prophets, the beginning and the ending of their lives were on the same day. That they lived a full, complete life, no partial years, that it was beginning of their life and ending of their life was on the same day. So what they say is, hey, if we know when Jesus died, well, then that must also be the day he was born. And I know that seems a little weird to us. Here's a picture of what's called the Annunciation. It's when the angel announces to Mary that she has been chosen. I don't know if you can see what's going on up there in that top corner. That's a little blurry, but you got God sending Jesus, and there's the dove of the Holy Spirit. But baby Jesus is carrying a cross, because in their mind, the birth and the death are linked. And so there's this idea, right? This ancient belief that a prophet's life begins and ends on the same day. And so they take that and they say, okay, well, if Jesus died during Passover in this certain year, then that means he died on March 25th. Well, if you do the math, if he's conceived on March 25th, or if he's conceived on March 25th, then when was he born? Right? December 25th. And so that's how they would arrive at the December 25th date. No pagan festivals, right? No cultural appropriation from Roman gods and celebrations. However, there was another way that people argued, and I think this is where you get the January date, dating Jesus' birth from John the Baptist. There's a few things that we can know. Okay, the Jewish priests functioned in cycles, right? John the Baptist's dad, he was a priest, right? Zacharias, he was a priest in the temple. That's where the angel appeared to him and said, hey, I know your wife is barren, but you're going to have a kid anyway. If John, and Luke tells us that Zacharias, John's dad, was serving in the temple when the angel appeared to him, and then we can assume conception happened shortly thereafter. And then John is 6 months older than Jesus. So if we can figure out when John was born, then we'll know when Jesus was born. That's how their reasoning goes. Now, it gets a little convoluted. I'm not going to say that this is a good argument, but this is the argument that's presented in the historical documents. We have our old friend Josephus. Everybody loves Josephus. That's Josephus. Well, it's not actually him. It's a statue of him. But Josephus, a historian of the time, wrote about a ton of stuff. And he points out to us that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed on the 9th day of the month of Ab, or Av, depending on how you want to pronounce it, in AD 70. Oh, okay, well, that's great. That's when the temple was destroyed. How does that get us a date? Because other Jewish traditions tell us that the priests who were in service at the time the temple was destroyed were the first order, the first cycle of priests. And it was at that time. So you have the first cycle of priests serving in the temple on the 10th day of the month of Av. Okay. Well, if you do your math, then you can figure out, so they claim, there's some problems with this, but the way they do their math and figure it out, they say, oh, well, then Zacharias was serving in the temple between October 2nd and October 9th. So you see how they're just taking some material, they're going, okay, Josephus says this, these Jewish other sources say this, put the two together, and we get that John the Baptist's dad is in the temple October, early October is when he's serving. Angel appears, you're going to have a kid, he goes home, John is conceived, right? So in early October, John the Baptist is conceived. In Luke, it tells us that Mary comes to visit Elizabeth somewhere right around the 6-month mark. Okay, so you get Mary coming to visit in March. You do the math, it's a little fuzzy, but you kind of do the math there. And then it says that in Luke, I believe it's 1 verse 56, it says that Mary stays with Elizabeth about 3 months and then she leaves and then John the Baptist is born. So again, these aren't exact firm measurements, but it's roundabout. So John the Baptist is born, would have been in June, and then June plus 6 gets you to December. Now there's other things that they work in there, other assumptions and conclusions to get the exact date. But, this is how they would argue and present. This is why it's in December. If you like a visual representation, if you're more of a visual learner, there you go. Got you a nice little graph of how all that overlaps and works. You're welcome. The thing here is, the way, and this is where I think that the Eastern Church gets their January date, because they don't say that that it would have happened in March, right? The way they count it is that Jesus would have been born in, or that Jesus would have been conceived in April, right there in the early April. So they go, oh, well, the date of conception was April 6th. Plus 9 months gets you January 6th. And so that's how there's something in there that they date a little bit different. So you get the Eastern Church with the January and the Western Church with the December. And so that's that. So any questions about how they kind of come to that?
Should we celebrate both just to be sure?
I think we should. That way we twice the presents. Okay? By the way, the 12 days of Christmas, they're not the 12 days leading up to Christmas. They're actually the 12 days between December 25th and January 6th. Because in certain church traditions, January 6th is also considered Epiphany. It's whenever Christ is announced, is realized as being God in the flesh. They will often say it's like the baptism is celebrated on that day also. But no, because that was what was that, 8 days? I think I don't remember, but so no. And I'll be the first to say I'm not sure these arguments actually hold water. I don't know that we can actually stand firm and go, yes, Jesus was born on December 25th. I don't think we can actually know that. The point is, this is the way they were arguing. This is how they got to the date back then. They weren't taking over pagan festivals. They weren't, trying to ritualize pagan stuff and borrowing. They weren't just trying to sanctify, holidays so they could go in and use that as a missionary technique or whatever. That's not what they were doing. This is why they picked the dates they picked. So, 8 days in Luke. Thank you. Yes. I'm glad I got that right. It's always embarrassing whenever the preacher gets it wrong. Okay, any other questions about the birth and the dating of the birth and the celebration of it, in the early church? So that first few centuries, now it's established, and this is how it's pretty much done. So now we have some common kind of symbols and traditions, and there's more that I was able to get put into the presentation. One thing that people will point at is Christmas trees. They'll say Christmas trees are pagan. You're not supposed to celebrate that. They'll point to a Roman cult called the Asherah cult that supposedly decorated trees as part of their worship. Or some people will claim that they are kind of remnants of like the Ashtaroth poles in the Old Testament, which seems kind of weird because I don't know why Germans, because Christmas trees originated in Germany. I don't know why Germans are celebrating a Roman cult or 2,000-year-old dead Canaanite religion. So there's basically three main traditions about where Christmas trees came from. Some of them are a little more legendary than others. The first one is Saint Boniface and the felling of Thor's oak. Okay, this is a fun story. Let me read this. It says, it is said that upon entering a town in northern Hesse, Boniface learned that the people worshipped the god Thor, and they believed that Thor resided in a great oak tree among them. So Boniface determined that if he wanted to earn an audience with the people, he would have to confront Thor. He announced before the people that he was going to cut down that oak tree, and he openly challenged Thor to strike him down. Miraculously, as Boniface began to chop the oak, a mighty wind blew and it hurled the tree to the ground. Tradition holds that a fir tree was growing in the roots of the oak, and Boniface claimed that the tree was a symbol of Christ. And then the people accepted his message, and the tree would then serve as a reminder of the mighty God who was humbly born into the world on Christmas Day. So that's one theory. That's one kind of legendary idea. I like it. Chop down a tree. Another possible one is in Germany, they had what they called paradise plays. So at one point in the past, they would put on these plays, these performances that commemorated the Garden of Eden. And the trees, they would decorate the trees with like apples because that was, assumed to be the fruit. And so they had this going on. And at one point, there was some religious persecution. And so they weren't able to perform these plays publicly, so they would put the trees up in their homes. And then that kind of morphed into what we know as Christmas trees. That's one claim that people say. One of the most popular ones, however, is Martin Luther. Of course, everyone loves Martin Luther, so he probably gets credit for lots of things he didn't actually do. So through Martin Luther, by way of the British family, we got Christmas trees. Because what happened was, apparently, the story goes that Luther was walking home one day, and he looked up through the trees, and it was a beautiful, bright, clear sky, and he saw the stars twinkling through the trees, and he thought, that is so beautiful, and he was moved by the beauty and magnificence of God's creation. So he went home, and he cut down a tree, and he put it in the house and decorated it with lights. And that's the origin of the Christmas tree. And so that's the legend that goes there. One thing we do know that's not legend is that I think it's about 300 years later, in the 1800s, you had Prince Albert, who was from Germany, who married into the British royal family. And he brought with him this custom of setting up and decorating trees at Christmas time. And being, kind of the pop star of the day, right? The royal family, the paparazzi would be, taking pictures in the windows and everything. No, they'd actually paint. They would actually paint pictures and portraits of these beautiful trees and setups, and they would get published and shown about. And then so year after year, people were seeing this, beautiful display of these trees, and just the practice grew. It went from the royal family to the common folk and around the empire. It just kind of became a thing that people did, and then it migrated and found its way over to America as well. And so that's really, at least the second part of that, I don't know about Martin Luther, but the second part of that is how Christmas trees kind of came to be commonplace in our culture and how we celebrate them. Because for hundreds of years, they were only big in Germany. The Germans were the only ones really doing it. And then you had this German prince married into the British family, and boom, there it goes. So, are there any other things that maybe you've heard about Christmas trees or anything? Because I've heard all sorts of things, but none of them actually seem to have any real bearing. There's a lot of theory and myth that surrounds it. So, now what about this guy? Everyone loves this guy. Well, that guy. Most people don't know who this guy is, but they like that one over there. The one on your left, the one on the left, you're probably quite familiar with. The one on the right here is St. Nicholas, right? So a lot of times you'll hear the guy on the left be referred to as jolly old St. Nick. Well, actually, he doesn't have much in common with the actual St. Nick. So this idea of Santa Claus, how did we get this jolly, guy in a red suit delivering presents to kids? It had its roots in the actual person of St. Nick. St. Nicholas was a bishop in a town of Myra. Not very much is known about him. There's all kinds of stories about him, some of them obviously myth and legend. Others a little more believable. They all kind of agree that he was wealthy, that he was born into a wealthy family, and he was very generous. Some say that his parents died early, so he inherited all this wealth, and he would just give it away. One story has him that there was a poor family in town that the dad didn't have money for the dowry to marry off his daughters, and so they were going to have to go into servitude and be prostitutes or whatever. And so he secretly kind of dropped money in their window so that they would have the money for the dowry so they could get married. Pretty much everything agrees that he was very generous and he enjoyed secret gift giving. Which, if you're independently wealthy, I can see how that could be a lot of fun. And so the legends grew. One of my favorite, and unfortunately, I don't think it's true. It kind of has a little too much of a myth sound to it. Apparently, he supposedly traveled to the Council of Nicaea. Right? Remember the Council of Nicaea? That's the one where you had the heretic Arius was teaching that Jesus wasn't really God, and so you had that whole ordeal going on. Apparently, Nicholas was so enraged that this man was teaching these horrible things that he traveled all the way to the council just so he could punch him in the face. Which I'm like, that's my kind of guy. Let's punch some heretic. No, let's not do that. Where it gets kind of wonky is, one, there's no record of him actually being at the council. And two, the way the story goes is the other bishops were so upset at his behavior, they were going to have him stripped of his office and kicked out. But then Jesus and Mary appeared beside him. So they said, oh, okay, he has their blessing. He can stay. Well, okay, that part probably didn't happen. So he probably didn't actually travel to Nicaea to punch Arius, but who knows? So the story grew and different legends and everything kind of formed. There's actually a day that is St. Nicholas Day that is celebrated by giving of gifts, to commemorate his generosity and everything. Fast forward, again, good old Martin Luther, he hated the idea of celebrating this. They thought he thought that St. Nick was becoming this mythological figure and was kind of taking over in Christmas time, being focused on more than Jesus. And he said that we need to focus on the Christkind, which is the kind of German, just means Christ child. That the purpose, the meaning of Christmas is the Christ child. And unfortunately, cross language, it kind of got changed from Christkind to Kris Kringle, and people call Santa Kris Kringle. And so Martin Luther, trying to get people to focus on Jesus, actually people just ignored Jesus and applied the name to Santa Claus. And so that kind of backfired and just shows how much people prefer Santa over Jesus. Our modern concept, however, isn't grounded in any of this historical thing. Our modern concept of who and what Santa is comes from two main places. A poem that I'm sure you're all familiar with, The Night Before Christmas. It's actually a rather long poem. If you've ever seen the whole thing, that part that we typically could probably all recite from memory is just a little, it's a long poem. But it shapes a lot of the idea that this is where you see Santa turn into a jolly guy, with a belly that shook like a bowl full of jelly, and with the flying reindeer and coming down a chimney, and all that kind of stuff. So that's where that concept kind of comes into the popular culture. But then a lot of kind of the imagery and the way we picture Santa, a lot of it comes from Coca-Cola. Because way back in the day, Coca-Cola said, hey, Christmas time, let's sell some soda, let's use Santa. And what's interesting is if you see pictures of Santa 100 years ago or so, he's not in a red suit. Or if he's in a red suit, maybe it's reddish, maybe kind of reddish brown. I've seen pictures of like more of a reddish brown or maybe a green, different color suits. However, Coca-Cola's colors are red and white. So they made Santa's colors red and white. And just through their marketing year after year after year after year after year for the last, I don't remember how long when they started doing this, it's just settled into the mindset of the red and white outfit of Santa. And so our current concept of, what people pretend, they play, the jolly old fat guy flying through the air with reindeer and delivering presents to little kids in a red and white suit, it's all pop culture. It doesn't have any grounding in history. The only thing that even remotely has historically is that St. Nick was a generous person who liked to give secret gifts to people. But it's so far detached from anything else involving St. Nick, you can't really call Santa St. Nick. The two really don't have much to do with each other beyond gift giving.
But Saint Nick did have
No flying reindeer for Saint Nick. I'm sorry. That's usually why we put him over in the other building with the youth. That's so. Any clause? The name. Well, it has to do with languages because Saint Nicholas in Dutch it kind of transliterates and becomes Sinterklaas. That Saint Nicholas Sinterklaas. That's just how the language kind of says it, you know. And then Santa Claus becomes Santa Claus. It's just as these things jump languages, right? The pronunciation of words change, and so that's actually where we get Santa Claus. What's that? Santa Flaw. Yeah, Santa Flaws. Don't believe in Santa. He's full of flaws. Yeah. You know, I think the important thing is that whatever or however we celebrate Christmas, that we make sure that the reason for it is Jesus, right? If someone, I love how I heard someone ask this question, if someone from a foreign culture came over to your house at Christmas time, what are they going to think you worship? Fat man in a red suit, right? Walmart, Amazon. Yep. A couple other little things that I came across. The Nativity, as we understand it, that was invented by Saint Francis of Assisi. He wanted, because there were some kind of things like that were going on in churches, but he wanted to bring it to the people, and so he wanted to put on public nativity displays for the poor people. And so he got the whole setup. He had a friend who had some of the stuff he needed, and he'd get, borrow animals and everything, and he'd put on a nativity. And the idea was so that the poor people in the streets can see that Jesus could, understand their plight, that he was born into humble means, and so they could relate to, because it's like you're a poor person, you walk into the church, you're seeing the, guy up front in the fancy robes and gold everywhere, and, the kind of stuff. You're not associating, Jesus and poverty, but you see the nativity, and they could go, oh, wow, Jesus came into the world poor. I can relate to that. He can relate to me. And so kind of that's where the nativity practice came from. And so I'm trying to think what else that I came across I didn't have time to put in the presentation. Mistletoe, which is always kind of a weird thing. It's like, hey, there's a weed hanging over your head. Kiss somebody. I never really understood that one. But the symbolism, how it got introduced in Christmas time, is because it's such a hardy plant. It's actually parasitic. It grows on trees. And so because of that, while things around it are dying, it's thriving, so it got associated with life. And Jesus brings life. And so that symbolism kind of got tied into Christmas with the celebration of new life. Jesus. Yes, thank you. That's all you heard there was Jesus is a parasite. That's glad to know you're paying attention. Yes, Jesus is a parasite. He grows inside of you, and the life that you live in, your sin dies. Right, there you go. All right. Thank you. Good one. Yes. Lynn with the assist. Okay. All right. We are about out of time. Anything else? Any other questions or thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, it was supposed to. They had their dates wrong, but that was the intention. Right. Yeah, BC is before Christ. AD is Latin for the year of the Lord. So it's at the moment of his birth. So the day of his birth, it changes. So there is no in between. So, yeah. Oh, well, yeah, I was dating from his death and resurrection, because that year is when the church began. So I was taking a look at church history, and so the church started after his death, resurrection, and ascension, and then, so I was just looking at church history. That's why I didn't back that all the way up to his birth. Which Jesus wasn't actually born in year one. They had their dating wrong. His birth was actually, Jesus was born before Christ. He was born in either 1 or 4 BC, depending on how you date that. Right. Well, the calendar with the BC and AD came like in the Middle Ages. We're talking over 1,000 years later. Somebody remade the calendar, and they just kind of got their math wrong a little bit in figuring out where year 0 was. What's that? Yeah, well, because the Jewish calendar has 12 months of 30 days each. So they only have 360 days. And so someone was making a calendar that actually has the 365-day calendar, and just somewhere along the line of trying to calculate when Jesus was born, they got their math wrong. And so the year that we celebrate as, or the year that we observe as being, where it switches, he had already been born. He was a toddler by then. Yeah, and I forget how they I don't know. Not in any realistic sense, because by now everybody knows there's actually 365 days, and a 360-day calendar would just kind of throw you off. That'd be a heck of a leap year every now and then. So, but yeah, I forget how they do that with the leap years and stuff. A lot of ancient cultures had a lunar calendar. That's what it is. The beginning of every new month in the Jewish calendar is on a new moon. So day 1 of every new month is a new moon. But anyway, okay. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you again. We praise you that you would.